Welcome to Rica Subtest 1 online test preparation course presented by ricatest.com. Thank you so much for joining. In this lesson, you will learn everything you need to know about Competency 9. That's understand how to promote students' fluency development. The three instructional strategies that improve all components of fluency include accuracy, rate, and prosody. Teachers provide effective fluency instruction using a few different strategies. The first we'll discuss here is monitored oral reading. This is when the teacher monitors a student's oral reading. This strategy works best using the following framework. The teacher uses one-to-one or small group instruction with students who share the same or similar common reading needs. The students read from a text at their independent reading level. A quick reminder here, we find a student's independent reading level when the student reads aloud 95% or more of the words correctly and answers 90% or more of the comprehension questions correctly. And lastly, the text being read should be at a short length, which for elementary students, depending on the grade, should be approximately 50 to 200 words in length. The steps to complete a monitored oral reading lesson are simple and straightforward. First, the teacher reads aloud and models correct accuracy, rate, and prosody as the student listens. Second, the student practices reading the same text aloud. And third, the teacher gives feedback on the student's effort. If while listening, the teacher discovers some patterns of error, for example, not pausing at commas, the teacher should choose an appropriate place to review and say, be sure to pause when you see a comma. Let me read this sentence. Here, the cycle repeats, where the teacher models, the student practices, and the teacher provides feedback. So you'll probably notice by now, the Rica test, this is a common framework used for all different types of reading instruction. Monitored oral reading is the instructional strategy we recommend that you use if presented with an essay question on your Rica test about how to support a student's reading fluency. However, there are a few more effective instructional strategies, and what's important is that you find one that resonates most with you. The next instructional strategy to build students' fluency is called repeated reading. As the name says, this instructional strategy gives students the opportunity to read the same text repeatedly or several times. The method of repeated reading works because fluency improves with familiarity of a text. Important considerations when using repeated reading include the text being read should be brief and the same length as mentioned for monitored oral reading. The text should also be at the student's independent reading level. Also, the student should read the text between 4 or 5 times. Media can greatly help students read faster and for longer periods of time. For example, audio assisted reading, where the student listens to a plain recording of the reading with no sound effects, that's read at an appropriate speed for the student so that they can allow the student to understand the modeling of what the reader is doing, can be excellent resources for students. Once the student listens to the pre recorded audio, the student can try to read the text independently. The third method for providing effective fluency instruction is using the paired reading experience. Paired reading happens when students form or are paired together to read the same text. Now, what's important here is that if the two students' reading levels are similar, the children can take turns reading, for example, changing after each page. If the students read at different levels, it can be a great moment for the stronger reader to model effective reading and for the partner to listen and then reread the same passage that the stronger reader just read. When a teacher notices that a student needs to work on a specific fluency component, being accuracy, rate, or prosody, the teacher needs to use direct and explicit instructional strategies to meet the student's needs. If a student struggles with reading accuracy, work on improving the student's word identification skills. For very young learners, teachers need to provide direct and explicit instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, and sight words. Phonemic awareness skills are important because they are the part of the essential foundation for being able to decode each letter in the words that the students are reading. As children enter upper elementary grades, the goal remains to improve the students' word identification skills. And this is because swift word identification skills build stronger structural and syllabic analysis skills, as well as orthographic skill sets too. Next, let's look at specific strategies to build reading rate. If a student needs to improve their reading rate, this is often caused for students who feel embarrassed to read aloud, mainly because they make many errors while they do. And for a struggling student with this issue, we'll use the instructional strategy called whisper reading, where the students in the classroom each have their own book that is at their own independent reading level, and the children read the book aloud, but in a whisper voice. As the students are practicing whisper reading, the teacher walks around the classroom listening and monitoring, as well as taking notes in the teacher's journal. We have learned specific strategies now for building accuracy and rate, and next, you'll learn how to build students' reading prosody. If a student is struggling to read with the appropriate expression, a teacher should use the approach called phrase cued reading. This is when the teacher uses a text passage that the teacher has pre marked to support the student in developing and refining the student's prosody. Remember, that's expression. The first step is where the teacher creates small reading groups based on sharing the same independent reading level. The teacher then provides the small group of students with the same text, which should be around the same length, somewhere between 50 and 200 words, depending on grade level and independent reading level. Now, what sets phrase cued reading apart from simply reading the same text together is that the teacher has pre marked the passage that will be read with either one forward slash, which signifies a comma, or two forward slashes, which signifies a period or a full stop. Let's look at an example using a sample text. Here we have the full sample text. Now I'm using just a sample, but as you can see, it's sample text, sort of like one paragraph in length. The teacher here would ideally retype the text in order to exclude punctuation, specifically focusing on commas and periods. Now, as you can see with this sample text, we have periods and commas, but we don't want them. So let's get rid of them. Now we have the paragraph with no commas, no punctuation. Next, the teacher here, what they'll do is they'll add either one forward slash just to replace the comma or two forward slashes to replace the periods that used to be there. So it will look like this. Now, here in a real lesson, the teacher, of course, would use an actual story. We're just using sample text for demonstration purposes, but you can notice where the one slash is, that's where the comma used to be. And where the two slashes are, that's where the period or the full stop used to be. Next, the teacher reads the text aloud to provide a proper model of appropriate reading using the slashes. Finally, the students read the text in pairs, practicing reading and paying particularly close attention to pauses and full stops. Remember that your Rica test will ask you to demonstrate your understanding for providing effective instruction within each competency for struggling readers, English learners, and advanced learners. Let's discuss how we can meet the needs of our struggling readers now. All too often, students are required to read texts that don't really match their independent reading level. And this creates unnecessary challenge, particularly for struggling readers. Remember that whether the teacher uses monitored oral reading, repeated reading, whisper reading, or phrase cued reading, all of these texts need to be at the individual student's independent reading level. More often than not, weak word identification skills are the cause for our struggling readers' difficulty in swiftly and accurately reading a passage. Improving word identification skills is an underlying problem that, when put together, helps in other areas of the student's reading, such as improvement in structural and syllabic analysis, as well as orthographic knowledge, too. Sight words for our very young learners are the words that they will see the most often. And supporting them to automatically begin to read these words will help them better decode texts as they read. Next, work with the struggling students more often. Work with them one on one as well as in small groups, and provide them with the instruction and practice that helps them improve their reading abilities. Next, let's talk about improving our English learners' fluency and helping them out. Here, you're going to want to be able to describe at least one of these two approaches for your own Rica test. The first is using the phrase cued reading strategy, which we discussed earlier. And the second is an instructional strategy we haven't discussed yet, but it's called echo reading. And it's quite simple. This is what happens when the teacher reads aloud a passage, and then the teacher stops, and the student reads aloud the same passage using the modeling that the teacher just provided. So, like an echo. As noted in earlier lessons, the Rica content specifications suggest two methods for meeting the needs of our advanced learners. And this includes increasing the pace or complexity of instruction, as well as building onto and extending the current knowledge set and skills of our advanced learners. Now, for assessment for fluency, to begin, it's important to understand and remember that fluency is always assessed through oral reading. This means that if on your Rica test you receive a multiple choice question about fluency assessment and there is a solution that includes anything that's not about oral reading, you can eliminate those choices that might include some writing because fluency is always assessed through oral reading. Remember, the three areas of fluency that a teacher must assess are accuracy, rate, and prosody. Next, we have accuracy. In order to assess a student's reading accuracy, the teacher will use what's called miscue analysis, which is the process of examining a student's oral reading to identify and categorize reading errors. Note here that the paper used, the tool used to conduct the reading test, is called a running record. You're probably familiar with it, and it's the process of assessment called miscue analysis. Simply put, the student reads a story while the teacher listens and pays particularly close attention to reading errors, especially of patterns. Next, let's focus on reading rate. Assessing rate means giving a time test. Here, the teacher will need to use a timer, so have a watch, a phone, or a clock nearby. The teacher provides the student with a passage of, say, 200 or 300 words, depending on age and independent reading level. Notice here that this text passage is longer than the other assessments use. Can you think why that would be the case of measure for students' reading rate? Well, it's because the objective isn't for the student to complete the text, but to measure how many words in a minute the student can read. Once the student is ready, they can begin. At this time, the teacher records omitted, substituted, inserted, and other reading errors. Once the 1 minute is complete, the teacher subtracts the total number of errors from the total number of words read to find the student's word count per minute. Next, let's learn how to assess a student's prosody. The difficulty here is that prosody, which is expression, is a subjective matter. For this reason, an assessment of prosody is done informally. And here's how it's done. The teacher listens as the student reads aloud. The teacher is listening for pitch, response to punctuation, and characterization, meaning reading the story with dialogue if there is some, for example. Let's review the three types of assessments. The first one is entry level, second is progress monitoring, and the third are our summative assessments. Remember that entry level assessments are given at the beginning of a lesson or unit to understand our students' background information, what they know about a topic prior to us teaching it. And our progress monitoring assessments are given in the middle of a lesson or unit, and these are typically more informal in nature. They help the teacher check for current understanding from the students. And lastly, summative assessments are given at the end of a lesson or a unit, and they assess whether a student does not yet meet the standard, or does meet the standard, or exceeds the expectations of that particular standard. Furthermore, both entry level and summative assessments should be done using written assessments, while the progress monitoring assessment is done orally. The Rica content standards state that examinees will need to be able to demonstrate the ability to analyze and interpret results from these assessments that we give our students. So let's go over how to do that now. There are two main points that you're going to want to remember. The first is that analysis and interpretation of assessment results needs to be standards based. This helps make sure that all students are being assessed using the same validated assessment tools. Second, this is that analysis and interpretation must determine why students have scored what they have, particularly for students who may have scored below expectations. As this chapter focuses on fluency instruction, let's recall from the terms we learned in Competency 8 that there are 4 common reasons why students might be struggling to read fluently. These include weak word analysis skills. Remember, we said that this is the main culprit. If a student isn't reading fluency, check this first. Next, lack of familiarity with the content knowledge. Same with background knowledge. If a student or any of us has a lack of background knowledge about a topic, it's just going to take us longer to understand it. Next is having a lack of familiarity with complex syntactic structures, which we often see in content area books such as social studies and science textbooks. Remember, it's just different from a fiction book that has kind of blocks of words rather than, for example, a nonfiction book that will have diagrams, charts, pictures, tables, captions. It's a different type of reading. And again, we need to teach our students how to read both types. Now, assessing students helps the teacher ultimately determine whether or not the relevant standards have been met by both the individual students as well as the entire class of learners. This information found through the data that we teachers collect from the assessments that we give. So, furthermore, the data helps teachers correctly place students in small groups based on their current set of understandings and skills. Before we conclude the Competency 9 lesson, let's recap the key learnings. In this lesson, you learned how to promote students' fluency development. Specific topics covered include the 3 instructional strategies that will improve all the components of fluency. Can you remember what they are? Accuracy, rate, and prosody. Next, you learned about the instructional strategies that you can use to build students' reading fluency. The instructional strategy that we recommend that you use on your Rica test is called monitored oral reading. Then you learned about how to meet the needs of all of your learners. Remember that the Rica test administrators specifically focus on struggling readers, English learners, and advanced learners. To meet the needs of our struggling readers who are finding difficulty reading fluently, a sure way to build their fluency skills is to help them improve their word identification skills. Then you learned to create a lesson that helps English learners improve their fluency skills too. To do this, there are 2 methods, and the first one is use phrase cued reading, and the second is echo reading. Next, you learned how to provide effective lessons for our advanced learners and to stretch their fluency by understanding that teachers can increase the pace and complexity of instruction as well as build onto and extend their current understanding, their current skills. Next, you learned how to assess your students' fluency. Key takeaway here is that fluency is always assessed through oral reading. Also, there are 3 places of fluency that teachers need to assess. That is accuracy, rate, and prosody. To assess accuracy, you'll want to use a running record and then use the process of miscue analysis. Then you learned how to assess your students' reading rate by using a time test and finding the student's word count per minute. The challenging part about assessing prosody is that it's a subjective measure. For this reason, an assessment of prosody is done informally. Here, the student reads aloud and the teacher listens for pitch, response, to punctuation, as well as characterization, which means how they read it. If the character is an old woman, do they read like an old woman or a young boy or a turtle, however a turtle might read? They should sort of change their pitch and pronunciation for different types of characters. Next, we recalled the 3 types of assessments, which include entry level, progressive monitoring, and summative assessments. Analysis of the assessments we provide our students helps us look more carefully at the data we collect. The two main points about analysis and interpretation of assessment results we need to keep in mind is that number one, results need to be standards based. And two, the analysis and interpretation must determine why children have scored below expectations, or actually why they scored where they did, but it's just most important for our struggling learners. Lastly, in this lesson, you learn the importance for creating both individual profiles as well as class profiles. Thank you so much for joining us in this Rica test lesson. When you're ready, go ahead, take the Competency 9 quiz to check your understanding of this test material, and we look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.